I'm excited to be here. There's a lot of, I think, really cool stuff in AI to talk about in the social sciences. I'm, of course, going to focus on the things that I know, as we all do. So first, I want to talk just a little bit about networks for representing human systems. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about population level networks in my own work. Then I want to shift to temporal networks. You'll see kind of a flavor of things that we've seen earlier in the talks. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about future directions. So first, social networks represent a really powerful way to understand human interaction. And it's both a theory and a methodological exercise. So the key here is that it provides us both some basic theory, like the idea of why do groups interact, as well as like a method for understanding and forecasting and predicting. So it's going to focus on basic structural intuition. So things like systems and system interaction. It's also centers around how data and measurement focuses and builds, which is really important, right? Models are limited to the data, good data in, good models out, bad data in, bad models out. There's a bunch of classic visualizations that are important to know, but here, of course, we're going to really focus on sort of mathematical and computational models around networks. So just to give like some classic flavor, Lada Demek had this really famous plot here where you can see the blogs from 2004 and who they're citing, right? And if you color them, one blue and one red, you can kind of guess which group is which, right? One is the Democrats and one is the Republicans, and they only meet in a very like small area. I want to bring up, and I'm going to talk a lot about kind of population level networks. So of course, if you're familiar with Facebook, it is sort of one of those few realized, highly measured, like worldwide social networks, right? It covers about a third of the globe. Kind of interesting. There are also network dynamics. So here is organizational response to Hurricane Katrina back in 2004. And so you can see these emergent systems. So, you know, the disaster strikes, organizations come and they help move rubble and all these other activities. And you can see as there's network structure sort of arrives. All right, so I've used a lot of fun words. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. First, we have things that I'm going to call entities. These are sometimes called actors, nodes, vertices. And then we're interested in the relation. So maybe this is like friendship, kinship, collaboration, physical interaction, that sort of thing. So networks have been used in the social sciences for all sorts of cool things. You can have very high level conceptual organizations. So this could be like similarities and differences in attributes, male, female. Correlation among variables. You can represent like complex statistical models. You can even use this sort of work for protein matching. Then you have, of course, organizational co-membership. So think about boards of directors. You can have co-occurrence of words relationships. You can have sort of classic survey science kind of work, right? People nominate their friends, their kin, they report who they have sexual contact with. You can kind of imagine how this might be used in, say, epidemiology. And then behavioral matters a lot, right? Face-to-face interaction, especially during COVID-19, right? We know face-to-face interaction was very important for the spread. All of us here, no laugh at all. That's how grim it is. And then we have, of course, online social networks, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, lots of work around this. It matters both for, you know, in real life, as well as online communities, which have become more important. All right, so this is just a reminder. I'm talking about oftentimes the entire graph, but different subcomponents can be really important. And we can frame these in mathematical notation. So a graph G has a set of vertices, right? That's the people in the network, and the edges, their relation. So lots of times I'll show a bunch of these cute little plots. So the dots will be things like people or organizations. I'll call them nodes or vertices. The edges will be relations. This may be like our face-to-face interaction, or radio communication, depends on the phenomenon of interest. Sort of a key thing to keep in mind is the underlying data structures. And this is, of course, when we're talking about mathematical and computational models and artificial intelligence, it's going to work on some of these basic data forms. The classic form is either the so-called binary adjacency matrix, where like the relationship me talking to you is coded as a 1, you talking back to me is coded as a 1, and the labels represent the actors. This can be further like simplified to a so-called edge list, where it's just the sending and receiving. All right, so this provides a fairly basic framework. Obviously, this data can be made very complex and extended as we have things like attributes. Really important attributes, especially for my talk today, are going to be things like spatial embeddings. I focus primarily on like physical geographic embedding. So like we're physically here at the University of Washington, you go home and sleep at your house. But this could, of course, be more complex socio-demographic embeddings, and there's a lot of people working on that. The other embedding that I care a lot about is a temporal embedding. So these networks evolve over time, right? People leave the room, people enter the room, the network has changed. People interact, people start being friends at the beginning of college, stop being friends at the end of college, right? So the network changes, those changes affect outcomes of things we care about: information passing, disease spread, sexual contact networks, like people have looked at AIDS, right? And obviously, if you're no longer having a sexual contact, you probably are no longer passing AIDS to that person. So that's an important detail, right, of how the network changed and whether the nodes and edges are active. The other thing, right, and I've sort of hinted at this a lot throughout the talk, is oftentimes the network, what we care about it is the dynamics on top of that network as the network changes. This is known sometimes as network diffusion. The classic SIR or SEIR model has been used very effectively to try to understand epidemic spreads as well as like information spreads. In the current climate, COVID-19 is the like typical example. All right, so now I want to talk about how things have really scaled up. So historically, especially in the social sciences, the networks people have focused on have been very small. Think like groups of like 30, 40 people. And so there's been a huge move to work with and understand and model massive networks, right? Population-sized networks. So online, this can be very intuitive in the sense that like we know Facebook, at least at any single point, has to be measured because all the people continue to be able to interact or not as they choose, right? I know many people are choosing not to interact on Facebook, but it's there, right? Same with Twitter. If any of you guys engage with Twitter, right? It's all there. There's the API you can pull from it, LinkedIn, SMS, cellular, etc. There are also sort of conceptual and important networks that, especially as we're dealing with, say, epidemiological spread, right? So maybe we want to know the whole like network for a city like Seattle, or people experiencing homelessness, or villages in the Southeast Asia. All of these are like complete population networks, and they're of interest for a lot of reasons. And then I don't do a lot with this, but sensor networks are like a big deal, and you can generate population level networks with them too. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about my own work. Recently, I've worked on, as many of us, right, issues around COVID-19. So one of the things that's really important is people are not located in space uniformly, right? And so this breaks the standard SIR models in some important ways. And so here we put together a social network model for the entire city of Seattle or the entire city of DC. And you can see how people's spatial location changes the way the spread occurs over the city. And so what we see is this much burstier kind of spread that's much more heterogeneous, this social spatial interaction. one of the things that's really important on this idea, I think, and is this like nice follow-up paper that we did, is that not only are people not located randomly over a city, but people's ethnic and racial compositions are not uniformly placed. And it turns out that these sort of network effects impact groups that are more tightly packed and over different places differentially. And so we're able to show that under a very reasonable scenario in San Francisco, that the impact of these differential like spatial locations and ethnic like distributions results in very clear disparities. And it happens early, and it follows through the network and over time with earlier and more deaths and infections. Some recent work I've been focusing on is understanding the social networks of people experiencing homelessness. So one of the things that I did is there's very, very limited data out there. So I found what public data there was, and I found some old respondent-driven sampling data, like a network sampling approach on people experiencing homelessness. And I was able to estimate out kind of complete networks for San Francisco and Atlanta. And I was able to then look at, say, information passing. And this sort of thing matters a lot because the people with resources to get out, say, where a new shelter is or where a wash station is pretty limited. And so they need to know, should they be targeting online? Should they be targeting well-connected people? That sort of thing. Recently, I've further extended this work. So I have a colleague who collected a bunch of network data on the unhoused population in Nashville, Tennessee. And so you can take these sample data and you can estimate out complete network data. Once you have complete network data, you can estimate out a diffusion process like COVID-19. And so running a realistic COVID-19 diffusion process, we can get an estimate of the total mortality due to COVID-19. We can subtract that from the excess mortality by an excellent graduate student in the policy school here at the University of Washington, Fowle, who's collected all the excess mortality data for homeless over the US. And we can get an estimate of about 1.5% of mortality out of the total 3% for Nashville, Tennessee. Unfortunately, Nashville does not collect good data on their public health, so I can't really validate whether that's good or not. And simple like interocular percussion test, face validity, if you will, I can compare it against Seattle, which actually does collect really good data on this, and it's a very similar percentage. One of the nice things, I've been working with King County, and I actually have network data now for the unhoused population in Seattle. And so I'm hoping to make a similar estimate for Seattle to kind of, see how good this really works. But it's, how can we take these sort of network models and get out something on populations that are sort of underfunded, under-collected data information? There's a lot of power here. Other areas that I think that I've looked at and they're pretty interesting, right, are behavioral trace data. This is what I'm calling activity-based networks. These are these online, offline networks. So, anybody who has used like Runkeeper or Strava, it's a biking running app, or like a Fitbit, right? They collect lots and lots of data about yourself. And sometimes you can access this via API. Sometimes you can get it from the companies. Sometimes you can get it from the people directly. But there's lots of really interesting information on people's social networks and how that impacts their like physical activity levels. Here is sort of a demonstration of difference between males and females and group size interaction when running. All right, another area that I think is super cool and I'm very excited about, and this underlies a bunch of stuff that I'm kind of like working forward on, And that is looking at automated surveys off of online social media to responses in big events, in this case, disaster events. So I've been working with Facebook to do automated surveys post-disasters as part of their disaster maps. And so what it does is it runs a survey asking people a large battery of questions, a couple months after a disaster. And so here, for example, is one that's run in Australia in the bushfires back in 2019, 2020. It captures the Facebook population very well. It actually captures the Australian population surprisingly well. One thing I want to just show you is you can make some pretty straightforward statistical estimates of the total size of people who evacuated. And this matches very well in line with what the IDMC and the UN estimated in this case. So there's a lot of power and information here, and a lot of really neat things for thinking about, like how people allocate resources and understand like household movement in disasters and transportation, etc. All right, next I want to talk about temporal networks. This has a lot in relationship to some of the work you've seen earlier, right? So there's a bunch of statistical, predictive, and behavioral models for understanding how social networks change. This matters a lot, right? We come back to this epidemiological example, right? Disease only spreads if the network's still active. So as people enter, leave, as edges grow and die, this really affects how well the diffusion model of information or disease is going to work, right? So these things matter a lot. It turns out most of the historical models work in this area. They're really, really cool, but they are computationally really intensive. They're all built around some sort of MCMC kind of MLE approach, which if any of you have worked with MCMC methods, you know that these don't scale gloriously. And so I've been working for a long time on sort of culling it down to something that's much more like logistic regression. One of the nice things about like simplifying it is it scales up really well. It turns out to handle entry and exit. So migration, birth, death activities well. It handles missing data, and it works pretty well in prediction. So one of the nice things, right, is the strategy here is based on really focusing on really large networks. So if you have missing data, it turns out that if you just throw away your problem data in kind of a smart way, you can handle the missing data problem pretty well. As for prediction, it turns out that if you do some smoothing on the parameters, you can do pretty well, better than all the other models. And it also keeps the classic like degeneracy problem. Almost all predictive models, unless you do something to them, they go to it's really pathological. And so I have some very like cool work with a graduate student in stats that shows that you can make this non-pathological with just a little tweaking. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some work I've been doing more recently, focusing on looking at spatial clusters, getting the 2-minute mark. So I'm going to make this quick. We've been really focusing on migration systems, basically stable movement patterns. And we've been using so-called tensor methods. This works with fairly out-of-the-box software and allows us to do a low-rank approximation that does a really good job capturing these sort of trends. And so we applied it to US metro areas, California, Katrina, and Louisiana. Basic finding, we're able to recreate a bunch of qualitative findings in the literature on MSAs. We're able to show the classic Southern Northern California divide and where they connect. We're able to show this really cool kind of signal processing problem where we can show where people left when Hurricane Katrina hit and which counties they pulled from when there was the recovery, and they're different counties. So this is like a nice little feature. Future directions. As I said, I'm very interested in this use case of using online surveys combined with machine learning to improve good population estimates. And then I have this long-standing growing collaboration with Washington State, Stanford, UCM researchers focused on integrating big biophysical data, risk models, and social network data to understand responses to climate change all over the world. So last, a few just things I want to throw out there. Automated text modeling and networks is lots of cool things. This sort of large scale human labeling and surveys like I've been talking about, and this improved prediction and forecasting. And with that, I will open it up to questions, and thank you very much for having me.